Hi, everybody. My name is Karim Lakhani, faculty member here at Harvard Business School and founder and co-director of the Laboratory for Innovation Science. Welcome once again to our AI in the Enterprise talk series. This is an online series of talks, trying to find the best leaders and the best thinkers in the space and really focused in on how we deploy AI effectively in our enterprises. So just a few housekeeping elements before we get going and I introduce our guest. Please do turn your cameras on if you want. I want to think of this as like a seminar series where everybody's around. So even though we are socially distanced and virtually distanced, just turn your camera so we can all see you if you like. But please do put yourself on mute. We encourage you to have a conversation with us. So please use the chat button, the chat function in Zoom to both submit questions, give us your thoughts and reflections as the conversation is evolving. And throughout the session, we'll select some of your submitted questions to ask our guest as well. It's going to be fairly interactive, and so we're going to try to make it, responsive to what Professor Sweeney is talking about, but also what all of you are interested in as well. We're recording this session both as a video and later as a podcast as well, just so you know that. This Friday, you'll receive an email notification from us with information on the next session, which is going to be actually with Roger Magoulas, who used to run Radar at O'Reilly. And then, of course, we continue to ask you for suggestions and feedback to the series. And also recordings of our events when they become available. And then also, as you know, we're in early stages of setting up a Slack community about this topic, AI in the enterprise. And so you'll get instructions on how to join that. There you'll find materials mentioned in the talks, articles and resources that our team finds between events. And what we want to do actually is, get the community activated by inviting all of you to start thinking about talks you may want to give to each other and to the community members soon. So we're thinking about 30-minute presentations with Q&A from community members like yourselves. It could be things you've done, things you're interested in doing, questions you have. We really want to make this a community that addresses these questions about AI in the enterprise. So think of this as in between our monthly meetings like here, we'll do more things in the Slack workplace as well, and we want to drive further peer learning amongst ourselves as well. So I am so delighted that Professor Latanya Sweeney agreed to do this talk. She has been incredibly busy. So she's actually been in the background this whole summer and spring, part of Harvard's response to the COVID crisis and the technological tooling we need to be able to pull this off. But above and beyond that, that's just like, grunt work that, once you are a faculty at Harvard, you're just asked to do these things. You have no choice when the dean calls or the president's office calls and you have to do these things. But Professor Sweeney is one of the leaders in the questions around computer science and fairness and bias. She has a book coming up called In Tech We Trust. But let me just tell you a bit more about herself. She's pioneered the field known as data privacy and launched the emerging area known as algorithmic fairness. She's a professor of government and technology at the Kennedy School and also in the Faculty of Arts and Science. She both creates and uses technology to assess and solve societal, political, and governance problems and teaches others how to do the same. She's the director of the Data Privacy Lab at Harvard, editor-in-chief of Technology Science, former CTO of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, 3 patents, more than 100 publications, PhD in computer science from my alma mater, MIT, in 2001, being the first Black woman to do so, and also an undergrad degree in computer science from Harvard University. So I am, again, just so thrilled that, and Latanya and I are also research affiliates at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science, which basically gave birth to this lab as well. IQS has enabled us to create our lab infrastructure and make this work for us. So with that, Latanya, welcome, and let's get the show on the road.
Well, it's great to be here. It's always fun to spend time with Karim. I'm totally with the chat about more time with you is always a welcome thing. I'm also, why don't I start by talking about what are the problems when we think about AI, and then ways to think about these problems and ways to design around them. And I'm sure Karim will keep it active, interrupt me whenever he wants to make sure it's more clarifying or more interesting. So you want to build or use an AI. So the first thing I have to tell you is how much power that gives the enterprise when the enterprise decides that that's what they want to do. And the reason is because it's no longer a business issue or a company issue. It's also how you dictate policy in this country. Let me give you an example of why I say technology design is the new policy maker. This is what a camera looked like at the time American jurisprudence was going to try to decide what photography rules were going to be. And the idea is that and the decision turned out that you can take a person's photograph in public without their permission. This is what a phone looked like at the time American jurisprudence had to decide what were going to be the rules for recording phone calls. And the answer turned out, depending in the United States, depending on which state you're in, you need at least one person's permission to do so. And then in 1984, this device came onto the mass market. It's the Sony camcorder. It was the first device in the mass market that combined both video recording and sound. And what's interesting about it is it came with no mute button. And what that meant was as soon as it hit American boundaries, it created a kind of clash with our policies, because no matter what a person did, they couldn't mute it. They had to record both video and sound indiscriminately. And right away, cases popped up. One case of a parent in Pennsylvania strapped one of those to her child and caught all kinds of atrocities happening to her child by a school bus driver. She takes the video recording down to the police department and they arrest her for illegal wiretapping. Similarly, a Boston police officer was arresting a protester. A bystander pulls this out and starts recording. The policeman stopped arresting the protester, turned around and arrested the bystander. And he faced 7 years in prison for illegal wiretapping. Eventually, though, that case brought us to today where American laws changed. That's why you see a lot of recording of the police now in their public function. But those laws changed because of that arbitrary design decision, not having a mute button. And with technology, once you have a design that works in the marketplace, that design gets replicated. So if you look at your mobile phone today, it also records video and sound, and it does it without a mute button. I use this to make the case that not only is technology design the new policymaker, but because technology is so ubiquitous, we actually live in a new kind of technocracy where that design dictates decisions. So let me give you an example from my own life. When I came to Harvard, my professorship, I probably had been here just a month, having spent 10 years at Carnegie Mellon. And so I'm in my office, I'm being interviewed by a reporter from Reuters, and he begins to ask me a question, and I say, well, let me see. And I turn around to Google and I type my name into the Google search bar, and up pop these ads implying I had an arrest record. And I point to him where my paper is, and he says, forget that paper, tell me about the time you were arrested. I said, well, I've never been arrested. And he says, then what does your computer say you have? And so I then spent hours I had to spend money to convince the reporter that in fact I hadn't been arrested. So I spend money, I go to the website, and sure enough, there's no one with my name that has an arrest record in their database. And the reporter and I began playing, trying to figure out what was going on here. And then he said, oh, that's because you have one of those black sounding first names. The reporter is an Italian American. I'm like, what does he know about? What is he talking about, black sounding first name? So in order to see what he's talking about, I typed in Latanya into Google search image. And then I typed in Tanya into Google search image, and then I understand completely what he meant. What he's saying is that there are first names given more often to black babies than white babies. And so with that, I began to try to understand what was going on. I took a couple of months, did hundreds of thousands of searches across the country using VPNs. And what I learned was that the company placed ads on every adult American's name. And if your name was given more often to a black baby than a white baby, you got an ad implying you had an arrest record. Even in this case, as you can see, the person doesn't have one.
Wait,
And
can I just stop here? This is
sure.
extraordinary. Like, you've blown my mind. Like, I mean, I never I mean, this is like the fact that there are companies that are doing this, and the fact that Google allowed this to happen, maybe still does, I don't even know, that you can create an ad on somebody's name with just the fact that there are racialized names, and so that's what they're using. I'm just blown away already. Like, I don't know what to say. I'm like,
so so discrimination in the United States is not illegal. Because you think about, we give student discounts, we give, as I'm getting older and my hair is getting gray, I'm looking forward to my senior citizen discounts. Discrimination alone is not illegal. But what we do have in the United States are certain laws to protect certain groups in certain situations. One of those groups is Blacks, and one of those situations is employment. Now, imagine the two of these people, Ebony and Jill, are going to get a job. And when the future employer looks up Ebony, there's this insinuation that she has an arrest record, but you don't get the same thing with Jill. That creates an adverse impact against Ebony, and that's illegal in the United States. And so this study was the first to show that algorithms could actually discriminate, and in fact could break the Civil Rights Act, could be in violation of the Civil Rights Act. Now, what Karim is asking is, how the heck did that happen? And what's going on behind that? And why did Google allow this? So let me just spend a second to explain that. So this is how an ad network works. Different people are bidding for that ad space, that precious space on a web page. So in this time it takes to load the web page itself, Google runs an auction and decides which of these bids is going to be the one it's going to place there. In this case, what the company did was it said anytime the search string is a person's name, we'll pay up to 99 cents, sometimes less, but often less. And here are 5 kinds of context we might put for that person. It could be Ebony Glover arrested and so forth, all the way down to just something neutral like background on Ebony. And the algorithm is trying to make the most money for Google. So at first, it doesn't know which of these are likely to bring more income. So it'll randomly select one. But over time, it delivers the message that's clicked the most often, because Google only gets paid with a click of these messages. And so as a result, what the company argued was, it's not that they biased it by putting 5 different versions of Ebony Glover being arrested here, though instead it was a reflection of society clicking these more often when the name was given more often to a Black baby and a white baby. And so they posed this interesting issue. Did they actually provide 5 different ones, or had they biased it in the beginning? Had they biased it by implying arrest on all the 5 versions of Ebony's ads? Or in their case, was it just the reflection of the clicks that society was providing? Either way, it had this incredible adverse impact that broke the law. This model, these questions that came up here, turn out to be the fundamental questions around AI technology and the questions of bias. They tell us that if we could look inside and understand the technology, we might see something hardwired inside. But more often than not, it's either bias in the setup data or from the interactions that's causing the impact. In this particular case, we were able to show that it was bias on the input side. And in fact, later they were fined and so forth. So that's an example. Not only is technology design the new policymaker, but because of that ability to do that, that is the fact that the Civil Rights Act itself is up for grabs by what Google is willing to enforce or not enforce, or even other places where those same advertisers advertise. What are they willing to do?
So this is so interesting, Latanya, that again, what we're saying is that now if we thought that civil rights enforcement was a Department of Justice kind of an action, now it's a private actor like a Google or like an Amazon that now has to actually think about these things, both like the moral question, but also like, is this the kind of company you want to be running? Right? So even though if it may be legal by the strict letter of the law, the spirit of the law and spirit of sort of living in a democracy and civil society, this now is like a concern for private actors and for businesses.
Yeah.
Who are sort of stuck between, I'm optimizing every 99-cent click, right? How harmless is that versus the societal impacts when you do this at scale?
Yeah, and the other thing about it, so my background is in computer science, and for me, I think there was that moment that you realize technology is not neutral. There's this kind of belief before then that, well, technology is not neutral, it's just what we do with the technology or how we use it. But here, the design of the technology can exasperate bias, and believing that it's neutral can allow us to perpetuate bias or even introduce bias without the idea of correction if we don't actually own that the design can matter.
And doesn't, Todd has asked this question, doesn't Google and Facebook have a legal, moral responsibility to combat this? Like what have you sort of seen in the conversations with those companies when you sort of show them your studies and discuss what you're finding?
Well, I think it was quite ironic, I think, for Google, because Google had literally just given me funding and said, go do something interesting. And the thing that I did interesting was this study, right? Because, and so I contact Google and I said, I just did this study. This is the problem that I'm finding. And so forth. And they were like, oh, just publish. They just really in that moment had not come to grips with it. Yeah. And they didn't come to grips with it even when the media picked up the story until it began to hit the business media. And then it really got the company's attention in a very serious way. But their decision making came down to questions of how much responsibility are they willing to take? Were they willing to change their auctions to make sure auctions themselves didn't have bias based on what got in there? Yeah. Were they willing to go further than the kind of review they had now? Or were they wanting, or were they going to say, we'll just take care of that one actor? Yes. And in the end, they to some extent took the route of saying that they were going to take care of the one actor. So this has left open these questions. And I think each of these companies have had to really face that. Facebook had a recent issue around housing and advertising around housing and HUD. Yes. And again, not really owning the problem, but sort of moving away from it. We see a very different posture from a company, Airbnb, where realizing issues around who was willing to rent to who, and also the amount of money that a person was willing to pay or be paid for their same housing. There were several studies like that. You saw Airbnb take a very different posture. Yeah, amazing. Let me give you another example about how insidious it can be. This is from Alvaro Badea, this example. He's a professor at Georgetown. At the time he came up with this example, this wasn't actually in the real world, but today it's very common in the real world. Suppose I have an algorithm whose job it is to recommend for me people I want to hire. So I say to the algorithm, this is my job description, and it brings to me different people's resumes. And I say, no, not that one. Yes, this one, not this one. And I choose which ones I want to come in for an interview. But it's an AI system, so it learns, it adapts. And so over time, it only sends me people like this. That is, these are only young people, because it captured my own bias. My bias in this selection was against people who were older. Well, that's against the law too, right? But this is much harder to check because this is totally in that external interaction space, as an example. But again, we see yet another law starting to fall, the equal employment rights.
Yeah, so Latanya, what's interesting here also is, in the prior example, and the example you're also going to show us next, is that it appears that most companies, when they're deploying these algorithms and are doing them at scale, are naive to the laws they might be breaking. That they're like, oh, it's, you know, there's almost sort of this misperception that, you know, it's just statistics. It's just, you know, some deep learning net. There's no bias in the deep learning net. What's going on? And so they're almost naive. And like the engineers aren't sensitive to this, and neither are the executives that are enabling these technologies to put this together.
Right. Absolutely. And so it requires us to think about the problem in a different way. If we want to build an AI or we want to use an AI, how do we go about circumventing this? Why don't I jump ahead a little bit, give another example, and then
Yeah.
let's talk about what those ways of thinking might be. So this is Joy Bawani. This is when she was a graduate student at MIT. And what you're seeing here is her looking at a face detection algorithm. Joy is dark skinned, and what's happening on the left is it doesn't detect her face being there at all. In fact, it doesn't detect her face until she puts a white mask up in front, and then you see it is actually computing on her face. And so she went on to do several studies to show the difficulties that face recognition software has in terms of recognizing people, darker skinned people or women rather than men. And why did that happen? That's because most of the training data was almost exclusively white men. And so as a result, the face recognition is really horrible in some of these other ways. But yet we deploy face recognition in things like cars. You know, can I figure out the person or the face or and so forth. And so the downstream risks become quite large. So what I've done is I've given you some examples, real world examples, where if I'm going to deploy or design an AI, I have to think about what kind of problems came up, could be in the training data or the setup, where they're biased, where they're past practices. What do I do? How do I analyze it? How do I know? And then how do I offset it? Is it that my AI allows feedback through external interactions? And if so, to what extent can bias be introduced through those? Either way, to what extent can I analyze or study or test whether or not the results are having an adverse impact? What makes this kind of questioning difficult is the kind of thing we talked about just a minute ago. And that is that once it's packaged, we tend to trust it, right? And then once it's in the marketplace, if it gets as far as the marketplace, then everything flips, because once I've packaged it into a business practice, I get to hide behind trade secret. I don't want to have to deal with it. I don't want to deal with the liability. I don't want to deal with the embarrassment. And so as a result, it's much hard. A new layer, a legal kind of layer comes in. So I just pretend it doesn't exist, or say, I don't have to reveal it. But it still affects the lives of real people, and it lacks a kind of an accountability. So it also forces us to realize that our past protections in the space of companies designing and using AI don't work. And then in some sense, we have to own this idea that these companies or these designers are kind of making new policy. I'm always inspired by the saying by Albert Einstein that if you want to solve a problem, you have to think about it in a new way. You can't think about it the same old way and expect to get a new solution. So this comes up a lot in AI when the rubber meets the road, or the conflict becomes disruptive, is just trying to figure out, oh, do we need a new law? Do we need a new policy? It's not so much that we need new laws, or at least as exemplified in the United States. Maybe we do, but we certainly need a new way to interpret those laws, or to have those laws applied, or add some transparency. So now let's flip around.
Let me ask you one question before we dive into this. I think you'll lead us there, but Anuradha asked this question, like, should we just make this like a regulation? Like, should we just make this, you know, do we need a algorithmic regulation authority where you submit your algos and your data to make sure that they're not violating any laws and that kind of stuff? Like, is that the answer? Or do you think that's too naive? That's too much of a blunt force for us to be able to just as we have a FDA for drugs, well, maybe because and we worry about the adverse effects of drugs and the drugs are effective or not, maybe we should do the same thing with algorithms instead of businesses, right? That if you're going to use algorithms at scale, then you need to have it tested. You need to have your data set checked out and the predictions figured out. Is that the solution?
Well, I don't know that. I don't know that I would prescribe that as a solution, because we have to ask ourselves to what so where would that regulation come into being? So that's let me explain this slide that we're looking at here, and I think that begins to answer it. What this is the life cycle of technology. So first it's a vision, and from a vision it becomes a developed, and as it's being developed, certain decisions are being made about its design, and then it has to be packaged with a business, around as part of a business package in order to be, and its commercialization. And then it goes into the marketplace. It may hit some legal challenges in the marketplace. If it does well in the marketplace, we get this whole thing starting over again with version 2. So this is sort of what I would call the life cycle of a technology. The question that you just brought up is, where do regulators kick in? Well, regulators don't really kick in until you're about ready to go into the marketplace. And what happens by the time you're in the marketplace, it's already been packaged with its business, and the company has already taken a particular posture, may actually already have revenues generated from it. And so their openness and their willingness and how they're going to think about protecting themselves doesn't really allow the regulator to get inside the technology of a company like Sony and say, oh, you just needed a mute button there. Because in the case of the camcorder, it had already shown up on our shelves, right? So this is, again, points us to this idea of those who are developing the technology owning more of it, because it's much easier to make a small change here that avoids the conflict down here. So what you see in bold are the people who get to make decisions at each point. So in the beginning, the funder is the group that's funding it, that has the vision, gets to make a lot of the decisions. During development, the technology designers get a lot of decision-making power. By the time we get to the commercialization, business managers have really hardened it and put it together, and they get to make the decisions. And then in the marketplace is only when the regulators, journalists, advocates, and so forth would have an opportunity. So the question is, what tools can come to bear at each of these stages? A lot of times funders are motivated by principles. We will do no harm, only do good. Really good principles, but principles don't really get us deep enough into the design, because it's not that any of these technologies were just out to do evil. It was an unforeseen consequence or a byproduct. So one of the things we've done is introduce a new way of thinking about the design of the technology itself, stakeholder design, where during the design process, you come up with a kind of, when you're done, a warranty and a compliance statement, sort of like the old electrical statements that we can comply that this product is not going to cause fuses or blow or generate fires in the home. We want to do the same thing in technology design. What can you say that you've done? What are you warranting, or what guarantees can you make about its compliance with respect to what did you really test for, and what can you actually assert? The kind of thing that you can do once it's in the marketplace is kind of a Band-Aid, an add-on. What kind of policy change can we make? What kind of packaging can we do? What kind of procedure can we follow? That kind of thing. And then, of course, the other thing that happens is you get a researcher or a journalist demonstrates the shame of it all. So sort of demonstrates that, look what I just learned I could do. And then you have to deal with the politics and the fallout of that shame. Why don't I stop for a minute and maybe take some questions, and then I can come back and show some of the other slides if that's where people want to go.
Yeah, and maybe I'm just going to cold call Julia. Julia has raised a very interesting question about how to think about, has experience working with AI vendors, and think about, how this applies in her context where they're trying to deploy these algorithms at scale. So Julia, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. So, I mean, we have AI governance process that we've deployed internally. I work at MasterCard in data strategy. And so this process is applicable to what our own analytics teams are developing, deploying. But in addition to that, we also work with a lot of AI vendors outside, which are coming in to work with various business units at MasterCard. So we also have been trying to apply the same governance process to, and it's difficult enough, by the way, to apply it to internal teams. Once you start working with external vendors, you start to realize how little they understand about this issue and how little they have done, in fact, to try and address it. And so there's a constant back and forth. You know, you ask questions, how have you addressed bias in the data? You know, this is the data you're using. There is already potential bias embedded within this data. What are you doing to address it? And the typical response is, you know, they'll discuss bias variance trade-off, right? That's the go-to. And then the best response you're going to get is, well, we don't have a problem with bias because we removed all the sensitive attributes. Therefore, you know, these types of outcomes are not possible. And we know that's not the case because they're using data combinations, they're proxies, and so on. So basically, no one has been really addressing this issue. And then you see these vendors being utilized by bigger companies, right, deploying, accepting this for face value, and you can see the downstream risks happening. So, so it's been kind of a struggle for me personally. I'm trying to figure out how do we do this better and how do we scale this, because this is clearly a very big problem out there.
Right. So one of the things I clearly heard you say is that you want to take this leadership role, and that every company you're touching or that's working for you in this space, that you want to make sure it's adhering to a kind of governance model. And then you get pushback from them saying, what the heck are you talking about? I'm just using regular data. I'm just doing my regular thing. Oh, you're concerned about race. We won't use race. We'll use some, you know, but then it becomes there are other variables that become a proxy. Right. And so the question is, what is your goal? Like, if your goal is, you know, if your goal is to produce products to make sure none of this ends up in the kind of product that you want, that you're producing in your company, then this idea of saying to a company that's working for you, then can you guarantee, what guarantee can you make around the bias? And to some extent, you already articulated that. You said, well, they might say, you know, there are bias trade-offs. That is, I can't always, I think the best example of that, let me go back for a second over the example to bring everyone along on the same page. Maybe the best example of that is in the criminal justice setting, because in that setting, there have been some studies that show exactly the point you're making, and that is that there are these trade-offs around bias. So this is the recidivism algorithm. It got a lot of media. ProPublica first broke this story, and what they're showing is, so recidivism is someone gets arrested, and will they be let out on bail? And so the algorithm gives a score that it recommends to the judge about the risk of that person. So what has happened here is, I'll bring your attention to Brescia Borden. What happened with Brescia, she's walking down the street. She's a teenager, but a young adult. She's walking down the street. She sees a bicycle laying on the side. She picks up the bicycle, literally intending to steal this bicycle. She starts down the street. A neighbor sees her grab the bicycle, starts running after her, yelling. She drops the bicycle on the side. The police, by the time she gets around the corner, the police arrest her. Vernon, on the other hand, has had a lot of prior offenses, including armed robbery, attempted robbery, and even grand theft. Both of them get arrested. And now the question is, which one of these people will be allowed to get out on bail? The algorithm said that Vernon had a very low risk, so he was released, but put Brescia at a high risk. She wasn't released. These same algorithms are often also used in sentencing and also in terms of probation. And so clearly something's really messed up here around the idea that a person with this background and a person with this background, it's almost like you almost claim the numbers should be reversed. What studies have shown around the data that was used, so this is clearly a bias in the data that was used for training, and they used historical data, and so some of what is that result is showing us is bias that was in the human decision making earlier on, and now we see it replicated in the AI itself. But the other thing that came out of this is these algorithms can't be perfect. We can turn the levers to reduce bias in one direction or the other, false positives or false negatives, but I can't do both. And which one is the right one to do is how the scientific argument goes. But in some ways, what I say is America already made this decision a long time ago. The one that's right is that we always err on the belief that a person is innocent until proven guilty. We have lots of rules and regulations around that. That means that the idea that it's not that these numbers are just wrong, it's the certainty of those numbers that is in question. She's an 8, but I'm not really sure she's an 8. He's a 3, and I'm not really sure he's a 3. Right? That's what I care about. Like how often is this wrong and in which direction? And those are the kinds of bias values that I think we should drive. For those of you who didn't follow.
I think, Latanya, what you were saying is that, I mean, to Julia's question is that I think, like, in many cases, you know, on your conceptual map from, you know, vision to market and legal, many of the people that are on this call are actually on the far side of the market, right? They're already absorbing these algorithms, are already trying to figure out where to deploy them and so on and so forth. So the work up front, hopefully, you know, with your book and with your teaching, you know, the next generation of entrepreneurs and founders and algo builders will sort of think about this. But the question, I think what you raised an interesting question is, like, maybe you put the responsibility back on them to get guarantees around bias and outcomes, and then see how their legal departments respond to the request from a large company to say, I need guarantees on this side, on the algorithmic side, right? And so that's one way to sort of force the issue for them to go back and actually because when a commercial deal with an important company is at stake, they will have to go back and re-examine what they're actually doing or not doing and push that forward. Does that seem like a reasonable response, given that lots of people are trying to deploy these systems now as we speak?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think I muddled it, but yes, I do agree that if you're downstream from designing the AI yourself, but consuming it or consuming it by a major company, then the question is, what will you require of them? And I'll give you a good example of this point. Was a couple of years ago, I was asked to have dinner with this guy, the president of France. He's a really sharp guy. He had brought over thinkers from around the world, and he was trying to answer this very question around what was going to be France's position around this. In other words, France is going to be a consumer of AI algorithms. There were particular AI algorithms that they wanted that would reduce their healthcare expenses dramatically. And the only problem was, you know, around fairness, around who is going, you know, the companies didn't want to give him the algorithm, they wanted his data and so forth. And so the next day he makes a public statement and he says, you know, that the data is going to be open and that the algorithms will be public, or decisions making, any algorithm used for public decision making will be public. This doesn't quite scale to a company, but this idea behind where he was trying to go, and Germany sent a representative there to reinforce it as a European Union type of principle. But I think in terms of the question is, what's the equivalent look like for this in the company space? So if I'm a large company, I can certainly make a lot more demands, kind of like Macron can make a lot more demands than others would be able to. And the question is, the data being open was a call to say, I want somebody to assess this data. Tell me about the bias in that data. Tell me about whether or not I should trust that data. And so in some ways, Karim, the point that you were making is am I going to ask for a guarantee from the company to give me a promise on this data? Am I going to analyze this data? Is there going to be some regulatory group that's going to analyze this data? Do we go out and we hire, Kathy O'Neill has a company who will do exactly that. You give them the AI you want to use, and she'll be happy to analyze the data in there and give you a report. And then this idea, the second part of this, when you make AI algorithms that are going to be used for government, that you're going to make those public, what does that translate in the corporate setting? That means what he's saying is that whatever decision making I'm making in my company that's using one of these AI algorithms, I really need to understand, did I just step in it? Did I just put my company more at risk because I'm using it? How am I going to assess that? Like what kind of downstream process do I use to see whether or not there's been an adverse impact to my use of this technology? You want to figure that out before some researcher or journalist figures it out, for example.
Great. Latanya, I just want to do a time check. We have 15 minutes left, and I know you've got some great stuff also to share. So maybe you want to decide what to tell us now. You've got such an amazing set of materials to share with us, and so potentially the ways in which you help folks think about the design process up front would be useful as well.
Well, sure. So this is the slide I showed a minute ago. The idea here, so iterative design and rapid prototyping is a part of the way we tend to build technology. And basically it's usually it's an iterative process that goes around these three buckets. I came up with a good idea of something I want, I rush to get a prototype, I test it, and I keep bouncing between these. And what this design is saying is that, well, what you should probably do before you rush to build something is to figure out what the adverse consequences might be, or what we already do a lot of this kind of stakeholder assessment anyway, like in usability studies and things like that. But now what we're doing is just trying to expand that to be broader than just a usability study, but to include things like adverse consequences the technology might have. And now I will keep building it and testing it until I can make some guarantees. And that's what we were just talking about a minute ago.
Got it.
I see there's some more comments in the chat. Let me stop for a minute. I want to make sure that I'm answering your questions or addressing the issues that you want to bring forward. And I see that one of them, well, it just disappeared on me. The question is, what about the privacy and sensitivity around demographic data? That you may not even have the access to the data in order to determine whether or not this data has bias and so forth. And I could even go further, that understanding, given an arbitrary data set that's going to be used to train the AI, to what extent, how do I know about the bias that might exist in the data, and then what do I do to anti-bias the data? It's kind of a data science study all by itself, right? So it's not the case that we can just sort of give an easy answer. It depends on the specifics of the data. But the access to the data, the question that was raised on privacy. So we're amidst an explosion in data in the United States. So your ability to get the data is often, especially if it's data related to the company, to your own service, may not be an issue. I'm not saying I'm not saying that there won't be circumstances where data access could be an issue, but in many ways, it's not really an issue. I don't know if you have a particular example. I don't know who it was to answer the question, but if you had a particular example, I'd be happy to help you with that.
I think you answered the question well.
Okay, all right. Do you see any other questions or?
So I think this is sort of in. Paris has a question about, I think he's asking about scale. So imagine you're at a Google scale, the burden on you to make sure your algorithm is debiased, right, and it's fair is much higher because you're just hitting hundreds of millions of users versus picking an algorithm for your next marketing strategy. And so, is that the right way to think about this? That there's a scale question here for us as well? Or would you rather say, no, we need to actually be sort of first principles based and not be sort of conditional on scale, because nobody imagined that camcorders would take off like they did, right? Camcorders was a niche market, and now all of us have camcorders in our pockets. So how should we think about that question in terms of sort of making choices based on the scale you might see at the moment versus in the future?
So you may have to help me make sure I understand. There are two ways of interpreting, two ways my brain interpreted what you said, and they don't agree. So one way of interpreting it is to say, Google is so large, how can it slow down its algorithm to account for this bias? So that might be.
That's not the way I thought. No. You know what?
Okay.
Let me ask Paris. Paris asked the question. Paris can unmute himself, and then he can ask the question. There you go.
Thank you, Karim. It's lovely being back in the circle. No, the question is this. My worry about the talk is that if there's too much of a legal burden to use AI and algorithms, a lot of smaller companies and startups will just walk away because of in the same way that drug discovery is done by major corporations and costs billions of dollars, because part of it is the proof you need to have of no harm, right? So is there like a way to think about it? If your algorithm could potentially create massive harm, you have to have a higher level of proof of non-bias versus some of the younger companies or the smaller companies or some of the more limited applications where you can, when one should accept for the sake of experimentation, the possibility of bias. Is that a way to think about it?
Well, of course, you could think about it that way. I'll push back on that way a little bit. I'll both adopt it and push back a little bit. And here's what I mean. It may not be that it's the size of the company that's the issue as much as it is the harm that society had already decided. So you could imagine there might be lots of biased data that I'm using in an extremely profitable way that has zero to do with violating any regulatory notion of bias, right? And so whether I'm a small company or a big company, I shouldn't be burdened around the bias question. And so it just keeps bringing us back to the use than it does the size of the company or the kind of data. It's more about the use, because if the decision making has something that's going to have an adverse impact that would introduce legal liability for your company or reputational harm, then it seems like there's just a natural desire to address it. The reason that we don't want to talk about it that way is because we can hide behind, there's enough structures that we can hide behind and make it not transparent to know that that's happening. And so this is where that tension really comes in. It's not that the company can't know their harm or their risk or assess that risk, but the trade-off for them is not, do I go back and do this data analysis, rework this AI, or do I just stonewall and claim that it's our black box, or we make decisions the way we do and we just don't disclose? And that's where I'm coming to this group for.
That's great. So Latanya, look, we have 8 minutes. So I think you should wrap up your talk and your presentation, because I think we want to hear from you, and then also tell us a bit about your upcoming book as well, so we can get people to. I know it's unfair to ask an author when their book will be ready, because I went through that same pain myself many times over. Thank you, Jin. Yeah, why don't you help close this out for us?
All right. So one of the things that we've been doing at Harvard is, over the last few years, we've been teaching students how to understand unforeseen consequences of technology, to shed light on these very things that we've been talking about today. And we've been incredibly good at teaching students basically based on what are the regulations, what are the laws, and here's this new product, this new technology, this new kind of decision making coming out of a company. How do you find the unforeseen consequences? And the results from those students have been quite profound. We ended up launching a new journal called the Journal of Technology Science. And it started when I came out of the FTC. So I was the Chief Technology Officer for the Federal Trade Commission. And the Federal Trade Commission is sort of the de facto police department of the internet because so many of the companies are American companies. And what I realized was a lot of these experiments that I tended to do don't require deep knowledge, but require a different way of looking at things. And so when I came back, I taught students those same kind of principles, like how do I think about what's happening out there and look at it in a particular way and make a scientific fact. And these are some of the first papers that came out when we did that. So finding price discrimination in the Princeton Review's online SAT tutoring. What the students did was they, the website that offered the prices, you typed in your zip code and it then gave you a price for the same online service. And what you see is that people in the East Coast tended to get a higher price, say, than people in the Midwest. And but then if you actually blow up more, it's not everyone on the East Coast is paying that higher price. It's particularly communities that are Asian are almost twice as likely to pay that higher price. This is another example of a project from a student. These are undergraduate students who found a fraudulent website using Twitter. Very much finding fraud online at the FTC is you run after them. Fraud happens, people complain, the complaints get loud enough. By the time the investigator goes, the fraudster's long gone. And so what Daniel did was he flipped it around the other way. He took the kind of phrasing and the kind of things that would make a link likely to be the kind that would be closed down or complained about and began looking for them while they were there. And it totally has changed the way the FTC goes after these sites. This is another one around price discrimination. And then this was one around Airbnb. There have been finding that white hosts versus Asian hosts on the West Coast, that if you were an Asian host, you tended to earn almost 20% less. Airbnb responded by changing the way its platform addresses price. And then let me just give you one more example. You can always visit techscience.org and see some of the other works of the students. This is an example from Facebook. So for years, Facebook had an issue with Facebook Messenger that it would drop your GPS location every time you sent a message. And Facebook, the media had not been, the industry media had not been able to get Facebook to change its policy. So a student wrote a plugin, and that plugin showed you everywhere friends and friends of friends were physically located at the time at the time they sent a message. He had like almost 90,000 or 89,000 downloads of that, and then within a week, Facebook changed it to stop that feature, as they called it. What's interesting about that, I contrast the response from Facebook to the response from Airbnb. Those are radically different responses. And Facebook didn't do itself a favor. The student had been hired that summer to be a summer intern. They waited till the student gets there. The day before he's supposed to show up to come into the office, they rescinded his offer. Wow. He turned out great. He ended up working for a company that paid him almost twice as much money. He got a TED Talk out of it. I mean, just all kinds of things worked out for him. Time Magazine ran an article and so forth. But the point that I'm using here is, one, that these are undergraduate students, which means some of these studies could have been done by these companies themselves if they would only ask themselves to look. And secondly, if the study does happen, whether your company is likely to respond the way Airbnb did, or is it more likely to respond the way Facebook did? And so I think those are questions for each of you to take away. I'll give a plug to my book.
Yes, please.
In Technology We Trust. It starts it starts at 9/11. Because I was asked by the government to build a bioterrorism surveillance system on US citizens with privacy protection. The government had figured out anthrax and they had figured out planes, but in their model, the anthrax was going to be in the planes. And of course, you know, the planes went in the building and the anthrax went by mail, but still, that's where the book starts. And it talks about, you know, the systems that were designed and so forth. Then it moves through time. It moves up to credit card companies and merchant companies around how the chips came to be, like at what point of the threshold would the company flip over into moving towards chip cards here in the United States. And it likens it to sort of this difficulty of moving companies to take on these roles of being society's keeper in a way, by looking at social security numbers and the problems with identity theft that have been posed by that. It then moves to the kind of things that we've talked about here, not only just the discrimination in online ads, but just looking at how all of our regulations are up for grabs by all of these decision-making AIs and how they operate. And then the book ends by flipping the script. Oh, and then we look at elections and the work that we had done. We were the first to show the vulnerabilities in the 2016 election, both on the election websites as well as in those persona bots. And so we then look at how do you flip it around the other way? How do we go from this idea of a technocracy back to democracy again? And part of the way to get back to that democracy is the kind of issues that we're talking about here today and the kind of actions that it requires you to take, not me. That is, if we're going to save the world, it's going to be because you decide to take on that kind of decision making. Thank you.
That's great, Latanya. Hey, if everybody can unmute yourselves and just give a round of applause so that we can all just unmute yourself.
Thank you so much.
Bring the semblance of real life on Zoom together. Thank you. So first, thank you so much again, Latanya, for all the work you've done, you're doing, and will do in the space. And you know, I was struck by what you sort of said right at the end there about companies as society's keepers. I mean, I don't think, you know, we here at HBS have sort of made that a thing that they need to be thinking about for our students, right, or to our executives, that in fact, this is now becoming an emerging role for us, especially around algorithms, especially around scale, that we have as much to worry about democracy and our society and profit as much as governments do and nonprofits do and so forth. And this is a new role. This is a new role for business folks. But as you're sort of saying, as you've shown through all the examples and your analysis, is that this is actually the thing that everybody's faced with now. Every company is going to be faced with this sort of society's keepers role. And so I think there's a lot we have to learn to do and figure out. And I always say that we can't just sort of defer this to our, you know, cousins at the Kennedy School or the law school, right? It has to be done here, because by the time it gets to the government or it gets to the OGC, right, it's too late, right? It's already embedded in the product. There's revenues associated to it, and the inertia is way too high. So I think we'll be spending a bunch of time around this topic for AI in the enterprise, because I think that's going to be crucial as we sort of think about not just the data, not just the AI factory, but also the ethics around that. So thank you for sparking the conversation. And then as soon as the book is out, we'll bring you back.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you
so
very
much.
Thanks
Thanks everybody. Stay safe.